So I'm not sure how many of you are aware of what the state of the seaweed aquaculture industry is in Maine. But in 2009, Ocean Approved got started in Casco Bay. It was one of the U.S.'s first seaweed farms. After that, Maine Sea Farms opened right here in the Damariscotta River. And then a host of other farms opened across the state. And by now, we have probably close to a dozen farms in Maine. But even within Ocean Approved, they provide seed to probably 6 to a dozen farms just within that company that are scattered throughout Maine. So it's really blossomed in the past 8 years or so as an industry and a potential way to diversify the working waterfront of Maine moving forward. Before I dive into what kelp aquaculture is, I want to make sure that we all have kind of the same language and understand the same terms. And when Debbie introduced the video and Patty was talking about phytoplankton, she was referring to microalgae species. These are single-celled organisms. They're not visible to the naked eye. However, this is a shot from space of the ocean. All that green there is a phytoplankton bloom. So even if you can't see it to the naked eye, when you look at a large bloom from space, it becomes quite visible. Macroalgae, on the other hand, are the multicellular seaweed organisms that you can hold in your hand. So microalgae, phytoplankton, macroalgae are the seaweeds. And seaweeds, generally speaking, share a common structure. Of course, there's always exceptions to the rule. But the complete body of a seaweed is referred to as a thallus. And then the leaf-like structures are called fronds or blades. Now, these leaf-like structures perform photosynthesis the way that leaves on trees do, but they also are the place where algae or seaweeds take up nutrients from the water. They sometimes have gas-filled bladders that help hold those fronds up to the sunlight so that they're not getting buried underneath the sediments on the ocean floor. And they have stem-like pieces called stipes that connect all of these blades. They don't have a xylem and phloem or a vasculatory system like plants do, so you can't tap seaweed for syrup like you could maples, for instance. It doesn't work that way, but it's just to hold all the bits together, more or less. And then the root-like structure is referred to as a holdfast. It's very aptly named. That's all it does. It literally holds on to the rock bottom. The types of seaweed are generally broken down into 3 large groups: the greens, the reds, and the browns. Sometimes the pigmentation doesn't always align with the names, but that's pretty much how it gets broken down. This is a tree of life. It shows you the organization of all living forms on planet Earth. And each of these kind of lobes represents a grouping of species or individuals that have a common ancestor. So it gives you a kind of picture of how linked species are through the evolutionary history. And here are people in this animal's branch down here. And if you come over here, you might see this fungi branch. That means that people are more related to mushrooms than they are to plants, more closely related to mushrooms than plants. Green algae are quite closely related to plants. That's not too surprising, as are the red algae. But what folks might not always appreciate is that brown algae are completely in a different world than the green and red algae. And they are almost as far from plants, really, as are humans. So they're a really unique set of organisms. So what are the brown algae that we have on the Maine coastline? Many of you might recognize this set of rockweed type species, the bladderwrack, which is a Fucus vesiculosus, or the Ascophyllum nodosum here, which is commonly referred to as rockweed. This is the stuff you slip on when you're trying to get down to tidal pools and scrambling over the rocks. These aren't really what we refer to as kelps. The true kelps are subtidal species, so you wouldn't find them in the intertidal zone. And there are 3 main species in Maine, and these are the 3 species that are also cultivated on kelp farms. Largely, it's the sugar kelp, Saccharina latissima, that is currently farmed. This is what it looks like underwater. It looks like giant lasagna noodles. That's how I think of it when I'm trying to remember how to recognize it. These blades here can be as wide as the hallway that you're sitting in. They can get quite long in a very short period of time. They're very fast growing. And the stippling that you see is kind of reflective of the water movement in the environment that you find them in. And it helps lift the blade up. They don't have air bladders, or their stipes are a little bit full of gas, but the stippling also helps lift them up to catch the sunlight. So kelp are a subset of seaweeds. They're the subtidal large brown seaweeds. All kelp are seaweeds, not all seaweeds are kelp, okay? What is the history of kelp presence on the Maine coastline? Well, once upon a time, we were actually living in an urchin-dominated system where the bottom was covered with pink encrusting algae, and there's another scientist here who researches this algal type in the Aleutian Islands as well as on the coast of Maine. But presently, we find ourselves in a kelp-dominated system, largely due to the overharvest of sea urchins. So we've removed the grazer that eats all the kelp, and now we're in a boom phase of kelp presence. That means it's a good time to think about harvesting, but even so, we want to responsibly manage these wild species, and the introduction of kelp aquaculture is not going to introduce something that we don't already find in abundance here, but it also will reduce pressure on natural resources, wild populations. We want to know more about the trajectory of individual species over the past decades and where we're going to be moving forward. And Doug Rasher is another senior scientist here at Bigelow who's in the midst of conducting a set of research observations where he's going back to sites up and down the Maine coast that were where seaweed abundances were recorded 40 years ago and revisiting them now to see if the patterns that we think are happening are ubiquitous across Maine and the same across species as well. So, how does kelp reproduce, and how is it able to so quickly take advantage of all the space that's freed because the grazing presence is missing now? Well, they actually have a pretty complicated bipartite or two-part life cycle. This is the sporophyte phase. It's the phase that you can eat, that you can hold in your hand, that you see underwater. You flip over the blades, and underneath is sorus tissue. It's a lot like fern reproduction, where you flip it underneath, and there's the brown fuzz containing, it's either the dust as the spores or the sacs containing spores. It's the same with kelp. There's spores under there that get released, and these spores don't float in the wind, but rather swim through the seawater. They are flagellated. They have two flagella, and they can move themselves around. And these are actually some pretty sad-looking spores. If you try to count them under a microscope, which we do, you've got to have some quick eyes because they're just zooming right across the lens there. They're very active little guys. They will differentiate into either a female state or a male state, much like people. Two sexes are present in this life phase. They produce eggs and sperm that fertilize, and then back we go to that sporophyte stage. This takes a matter of weeks to go through. This lives for a couple of years. We actually didn't know about this two-part life cycle until about the 1940s because of the work of Dr. Kathleen Baker. And it was her discovery of the microscopic phase of this macroscopic organism that opened up the possibility for seaweed aquaculture. And as you may be aware, in Asian cultures and in some European countries, seaweed aquaculture is not as fresh and new as it is here. It's been going on for decades, centuries in some cases. Well, in Japan, Dr. Kathleen Baker is revered, and her memory is honored every April 14th because of the way that she opened up the possibility for seaweed aquaculture that hadn't existed before. So how do you grow kelp seed? Well, you go collect that fertile tissue, the sporophyte frond that has the brown underneath it, and you get it to release those spores in the lab, and then you provide those spores with an attachment site. And usually this is just a piece of twine wrapped around a PVC pipe. And you'll see why that's the way to do it in a few minutes. But you start with some pretty empty-looking twine. You know you've put your spores in there. You hope they're attaching. And then 3 to 6 weeks later, you've got twine that's coated in a brown fuzz. Those are all the baby sporophyte phases. Then you've got to
It's actual.
get it out on your farm.
You guys go in the water.
Yeah.
There we go. We didn't need the sound on that. You've got to get your twine to unravel out on your farm. And so the reason you have it on this PVC pipe is then you can start it at one end of your farm and just unfurl it along the moored rope that is suspended between two mooring balls, two buoys, to keep that line at 7 feet underneath the water surface where kelp grows best, at least in Maine. So how is kelp farm? It's a pretty simple setup. You've got your buoy, your line with the kelp unfurled around it, and some anchors to hold it down. There are some more complex designs out there, but to be honest, it's really not much different than this. And 6 months after you've gotten that twine unwrapped around your kelp lines, your moored lines, you have tons of biomass waiting for you that's grown on there. There's not much that you need to do to it in the meanwhile other than tend to it to make sure that the lines haven't crossed. So when you're ready for harvest, you're pulling up metric tons of this stuff for a very small square foot space. So how is farming kelp different than any sort of land plant that you might grow? Land veggies. Well, they both require seed. They both have some sort of machinery associated with them. Land veggies require tillable land and quite a bit of space, but you can grow a lot of kelp on just a small lease area. Land veggies, on the other hand, also require fresh water, fertilizers, and pesticides. These are things that kelp aquaculture does not require. For land growth, you also can rely on seed banks and catalogs to get your farm started. But no such thing currently exists for kelp farming. There is no kelp seed bank. Although at Bigelow, we are trying to get one started. And what we're trying to use, since you can't just take those kind of flagellated, moving around kelp spores, dry them out and stuff them on a shelf, is we're trying to use cryopreservation or deep freezing of those spores so that we can call them up and use them to start a kelp farm on demand. And there's a group of us at Bigelow that are working on that, and these are some of the other scientists who are involved in that work. The other thing you have to be careful about with kelp farming is that it's entirely dependent on ocean health. We're not adding fertilizers, we're not adding pesticides. So your site selection is pretty integral, and you need to make sure that it's a healthy location for kelp growth. Let me pause here for a second and give you some context. So we know that changes are happening to the ocean, like it's warming, and it's becoming more acidic. I want to just start you looking over here because I'm going to show you what the ocean health looks like in Maine in terms of acidity. And we've got this scale over here, which is saturation state, and we've got at the top end, low carbon dioxide content, high seawater pH, which means low acidity. And this makes shellfish happy. This is the kind of conditions that they can calcify the best in and grow tough, hard shells and survive the best. When you get down to areas like this, where you have a very low saturation state value, you have high CO2, low pH, and high acidity, your shellfish are a bit more worried about their future. They find it more difficult to create shell. They are more susceptible to disease. In some cases, they develop abnormally. For mussels, their beards or their byssal thread that holds on to the line can become weakened. So it's not an optimal growing condition for them to be in this red zone. Here we are looking at the Maine, Gulf of Maine coastline. Down here's Cape Cod. Up here is our complicated coastline. And this is the same scale bar that I showed you a minute ago. Blue, good, red, not so good. And you can see that the coastline of Maine can experience some really low pH conditions or high acidity conditions on occasion, which are not so good for shellfish growth. So we're worried about this now. Some of the oyster growers, and especially the ones who run hatcheries, are already doing things to remediate the seawater that's coming into their hatchery before they start growing the oyster babies. Mussels don't have that sort of People that grow mussels don't have that sort of option because mussel growers depend on a wild set of mussel larvae and mussel recruits every year. They just, in essence, put out their lines, hope that something good is going to settle on that, and off you go with your farm. So, red zone, not so good for shellfish, happens on occasion. What does it mean for seaweed aquaculture? Well, how much CO2 can a species absorb, an algal species absorb? Today, in a less acidified ocean, 400 parts per million carbon dioxide, that's what we get reported for our atmospheric conditions, and it's reflected in our oceans. Or 100 years from now, when we expect at least twice as much CO2 to be in the seawater in the future. And this work was done about 2 years ago with a summer student here, Evie Fashon, who was part of our research experience for undergraduates program. And she subjected the sugar kelp to these 6 different levels of CO2. And what she found is that kelp really is a CO2 sponge. Today, it can absorb whatever carbon dioxide is present in the water column. Tomorrow and the next day and 100 years from now, it can absorb how much ever excess CO2 we're putting into the water column. So you give it that over 1,000 parts per million carbon dioxide, it says, great, I'll take all of it. I'm CO2 limited. And this is going to help me grow. And it does grow bigger in those conditions and faster. So sugar kelp looks to be a winner in that high CO2 world where we expect shellfish to be, quote unquote, a loser. I want to stop here and take any questions that you might have before we take a small... So many of you came up to me during the breakout session and were already thinking deeply about this question, but I hope that it's prepared you for some of the slides that I'm about to show. How are we doing for time? Can I dive right into it? Okay. So first, it might behoove us to understand how natural kelp forests can impact their environment before we start thinking about how farmed kelp might impact its environment. Kelp forests, and this is a little bit of a dark slide, but offer nursery habitat for just many, many different species of invertebrates and fish. So it provides this three-dimensional structure. This is more of a Californian kelp forest, but nonetheless, our kelp forest here in New England, it might not be quite so tall. It is still 3D structure that provides that same nursery habitat. They also exchange carbon dioxide with the water around them. And this is a borrowed slide, but I would have made this arrow here very large because a lot of CO2 goes into the kelp forest. And this arrow much smaller. They do exhale on occasion, but it's not nearly in the same proportion as to what they bring in. They also absorb a lot of nitrogen. Scientists use shorthand N to represent that, or phosphorus, P. And they, as a byproduct of photosynthesis, release oxygen to the seawater around them. So they're a natural sort of cleaner of the seawater chemistry where they're operating and conducting net primary production. So we can think of kelp the same way that we think of trees. We know we plant trees to absorb more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Can we think of creating ocean forests of kelp to do the same to help clean up our oceans? We call this the halo effect. And this is a theoretical diagram of why and how one might think about using kelp aquaculture specifically in co-cultivation with mussels to help remediate some of these problems. So we've got nutrient runoff from the land, whether it be wastewater treatment plants, septic systems, what have you. Carbon dioxide released to the atmosphere that's coming into our oceans. Can farming sugar kelp create this halo of seawater that's much lower in carbon dioxide or much lower in nitrogen and phosphorus in general, where it's being grown? And how big is this halo effect? How much can you see it throughout the growing season of kelp? Does it only happen for a short time, or is it there for a long time? And then if we can sell the kelp product that's being grown, this is a really unique situation where we have a solution that also generates revenue. That's got to catch some people's eyes more than a costly sort of solution. So, does it work? That's what we've been working on for the past 3 years with a group of people. We've been doing our operations out at the ocean-approved farm in Casco Bay and working hand in hand with Island Institute and the University of New Hampshire to gather some of these data. Bangs Island Mussels has been really helpful in providing context and even mussels for experimentation. And this work was funded by the National NOAA, National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration. Thank you. I have 2 small children, so my memory's not what it used to be. So, is phytoremediation possible outside of a jar? That's the term we have for this process where photosynthesis from a kelp farm is remediating the seawater around it. And we make some field observations in Casco Bay. This is Paul Dobbins, the former owner of the ocean-approved farm, and he so generously let us bother him to hang these instruments in between his kelp lines. And they have different names and they measure different things, but we are recording lots of parameters about seawater quality at a pretty high resolution every 30 minutes throughout the entire growing period of the kelp, the 6-month period that it's hanging out there in the water. And we take all sorts of other chemical measurements of the seawater to calibrate the instruments that are out there. And it's really important when you do this experiment to select where you're going to put these instruments. So the inside one is a no-brainer. Just find the center of the farm and hang your instruments there. But to compare it to what's happening outside a farm, how do you select where to put that group of instruments? What's outside the halo? We don't even know what the halo looks like yet. So we had to guess, and we guessed 250 meters away. Let's see what happens when we put our instruments there. So we figured out what was from a tidal perspective upstream of where the kelp farm is and put our second set of control instruments there. So here are pictures of Susie Arnold from the Island Institute and my tech in the lab here at Bigelow, Brittany Honish, collecting seawater samples and putting out the instruments. Let me remind you, I don't know if I made clear in the beginning of the talk, when kelp is grown. You put that seeded line in the water in November, and then it grows December, January, February, March, April, May. May or June is when you harvest. So Susie and Brittany were out there on Casco Bay working with wet hands in January, February, and March. It's not warm. And you got to wait for the perfect weather window to get out there and get the work done. I'm going to show you, I'm trying not to show you many data slides tonight, but there are some data that I just find so compelling that I can't help myself. So I'm going to share it with you now. Why I want to orient you to the axes first. This series of numbers represents seawater pH, okay? About 8.0 is the global average for seawater pH now. Down here, 7.9, and lower than that, we're starting to get into the worry zone. Coming along the x-axis here, I've saved you the bother of looking at a lot of different tick lines, but this data set runs from January 1st in 2016 to May in 2016. So this is the 2016 kelp farming year. We've got 2 squiggly lines to look at. The top squiggly line in green is the data set from the instruments inside the kelp farm, and the bottom line is the data set from the instruments outside of the kelp farm. So this is 2016, here's 2017, and there's 2018. What I want you to notice is 2 things. Yep, there's a lot of noise in the data set. The lines jump around. That's totally normal for estuaries. They're a busy place. A lot of tidal exchange, a lot of organisms breathing in, exhaling out, and a lot of temperature change over this time period, right? But what's stunning is that that green line is always above that black line. So the conditions inside the kelp farm are always better than those outside of it. It's more obvious in 2016 and the 2018, the instruments are still out there. We've been thwarted by some boat issues and some weather issues. We were hoping to get them this week. We won't get them until next week, so I don't have the June data here. But we think the same thing happened later this year that happened up here in 2016, where the magnitude of the difference between the two became more pronounced later in the kelp growing season, when the kelp is largest and really doing the most primary production and fixing the most carbon into sugars during photosynthesis. So we think this is pretty compelling data that 3 years in a row we've seen this effect of phytoremediation on the ocean-approved kelp farm. in terms of amelioration of seawater chemistry. We've started doing something else just this year with funding from TNC and also the funding from NOAA, where we have been mapping the halo effect around the kelp farm. So this square box here is the ocean-approved kelp farm. That is our boat, driving around and around the kelp farm with an underway PCO2 system, meaning we have a sensor on the back of the boat and pumped seawater is coming through it, and in real time it's recording the carbon dioxide content of the seawater. And if you're in the blue zone, again, blue is good, red is less good, not so good. And down here you see the current direction, and up here's the time running. And what we see over time is this kind of shadow that's happening, we think, from the kelp farm, where that primary productivity, which is peaking in the midday, and with the currents that are pushing the seawater that way, is showing a halo effect on the water next to it. And it's starting to give us an idea of how far that halo effect might travel. It's going to be very dependent on the strengths of the currents and tides that day, on how much sun is beaming down. On a day like today, might not see as much of a halo effect. There's just not enough light for a lot of primary production. But on a very bright day, you could see that this effect is more obvious. So we've done, these maps are very hard to make, take a lot of effort and a lot of money, frankly. So we've only been able to do 6 or 7 of them total over the past 2 years. But they're really starting to generate some interesting data about the size of the footprint of a halo effect. So up to this point, I've just been talking about how we can measure chemical changes in the seawater as a result of farming kelp. But the real question is, what does that mean for mussels that are farmed at the same place that the kelp is farmed? So we took, here's this map again, so we have the general idea of where the halo area could be. And here's the outline of the farm. And we took a 1/2 meter length of Matt Moretti's from Bang Island mussel lines that he's been growing on his farm there. These mussels are about a year old. And we transplanted them inside these predator exclusion cages. And then we put a set of these exclusion cages inside the farm, just next to it, further outside, and yet further outside. And then we measured a bunch of stuff that was happening to the mussels over the 2 months that they were out at the same time that kelp was being grown at the farm. And by we, I don't mean me, really. I mean Bree Groves, who is my research experience for undergraduate student this summer, who has done a phenomenal job and has designed this test to figure out what the true strength of the mussel shell is. So how many of you guys buy mussels at the grocery store or at your local fish market? And they come in those bags, right? And you open them up, and anything that's cracked in there, you got to throw it away. You can't cook that. You can't eat that. But the rest are okay. This is testing what it takes to get one of those mussels to crack, much like an eggshell, right? And it's a 2-pulley system that lets a weight smash down on the mussel, and underneath the mussel is a bit of pressure paper. This pressure paper has within it beads of dye, red dye, that upon contact will explode and release their dye. So the color of the dye on that paper represents how much more force it took to crush that mussel in the first place, how much more pressure that mussel could absorb before it got crushed. And here's pictorially her results. This represents a huge effort, many hours of work. But again, red, hard shell, lots of force to crack. Pale pink, weak shell breaks easily. And you can see these really bright red ones that pop out there. Well, guess what? Those were all from inside the kelp farm. And the ones that cracked easily were the ones from outside the kelp farm. So it's the first evidence that we have that directly links the cultivation of seaweed with a better quality product coming out of your mussel cultivation. Not only are they harder to break, but they're actually meatier when they're grown in the kelp farm. So their meat mass is a lot higher than the stuff that was grown outside. And I don't know about you, but when I go to the restaurant and I open the shells and there's a piddly little thing inside, I'm not too pleased about how much I just paid for that dinner. So knowing this now, what's next? I mean, I just want to ruminate on this for a minute. This was a 2-month experiment done this year, and we saw an effect of kelp farming on mussel quality this year. We're not talking about 100 years from now when ocean acidification is going to be a real problem, right? But we saw an impact even now. So I think I was surprised. I didn't have a lot of hope that we were going to see anything meaningful out of that particular project. And so we have also designed another experiment. And if any of you have time and want to take a trip downstairs later, I'm happy to show you this setup. The facilities folks here at Bigelow are phenomenal, and they help put this together. We have a system where we've got lots of small tanks that are gas tight, and we can have one large mixing system where we're adding carbon dioxide and heating it up, and another mixing system where we have present day conditions. So this is like what it looks today, and this is the window to the future about 100 years from now, and that gets deposited and distributed across these tanks. And then within these tanks, they're all going to contain mussels, but half of them will also have the kelp. And then they'll be either in this present day condition or this 100 years from now condition. And so we expect, again, to see the same kind of impact we saw at the Ocean Approved Farm in Casco Bay in this more controlled experimental setup. But we expect the magnitude of that effect to be even more prominent in the future ocean, where things are warmer and more acidic, and the mussels need a lot more help to keep growing. So we've grown all this kelp. It's done something wonderful for our mussel farm. Now what do we do with it? That is actually maybe one of the bigger bottlenecks to the kelp aquaculture industry. And there's lots of cultures that readily eat kelp. Ours is not one of them. There are people like me who enjoy it, but many who don't. So innovation and how we think about preparing and using kelp and incorporating it into our diet is one way we need to go. Some of those innovations include providing products like kelp cubes that are frozen, ground up kelp that you can add to a smoothie and thus avoid any flavor but gain all the nutritional value coming out of it. You can put it in pesto or pasta sauces too. You might just want to drink it. And then you could, drown your woes and help the ocean at the same time. You can get it in a lighter form if you don't want to drink hard liquor. And actually, there's a company in Maine who makes this stuff. Yep, Marshall Worth. So is kelp healthy? Well, you'll find lots of websites that tell you it sure is. Labeling for seaweed products is not standardized yet and hard to come by. But it is definitely true that kelp has a large amount of iodine. And actually, most Americans are iodine deficient as we try to cut salt out of our diet, or as we like to use our pink Himalayan salt instead of the iodized table salt that many of us grew up with. So it can help replace iodine, which helps thyroid function. I have a thyroid problem, so any excuse for me to eat more salt, I'm all for it anyways. There's other potential effects, but we need to get a better understanding of how consistent the nutritional value of kelp is, and Bigelow is well poised to do this kind of research as well. Is the message always good for kelp farming? No, I'm not a kelp farming advocate per se. There are some things to worry about, but I would point out that while we are still trying to find out what the arsenic levels in seaweed are, there are harmful types of arsenic, like the inorganic forms, and then there are totally inert forms of arsenic, like the organic forms, that just pass right through your system. And so trying to get a handle on the relative abundance of these chemical species, we refer to them as species also, if that's not confusing, and how, where the kelp is farmed, Maine's pristine waters versus elsewhere, and what kind of processing happens to that kelp afterwards, if that changes anything about the presence of these species, is still something to be determined. Rice and apples have a lot of arsenic also, so it's not unknown to the American food system that arsenic can be a problem. And in these instances, it can come from the pesticides that are used on those farms. If you don't want to eat it, fine, then wash with it or use it for other sorts of cosmetic purposes. maybe you want to sit on it. There are very, very interesting ways to use kelp in industry. You might want to fertilize your garden with it or use it as a spray. It's a natural herbicide, pesticide for many plants, and it can. So there are organic kelp fertilizers made from Maine that are readily available on the market. You might want to feed it to your livestock. Actually, they like it quite a bit. We'll seek it out. And it might actually have a secondary, very important benefit to our globe. So cattle are capable of producing a huge amount of methane. Anybody know how many times worse methane is than carbon dioxide in terms of greenhouse gases? 30 times worse. 30 times worse. So reducing methane emissions, especially considering that 70% of the globe's methane emissions comes from cows, is a pretty good goal to have. Just to be clear, it comes out this end, not that end. They burp it. And some recent work by folks in Australia have identified certain species of seaweed that when fed to kelp, only 2% of their diet can reduce the methane emissions by 80% or something like that. A huge amount, right? So an obvious question is, can Maine seaweed species do this? And we are working, there's a group of us at Bigelow that are also working to attack these kinds of questions. Are there any microalgal species that can do this kind of thing? There's the world of potential waiting for us in the National Center for Marine Microbiota and Macroalgae to explore. So I want to leave you with some final parting thoughts about what our Center for Seafood Solutions does. It really is a science evidence-based problem-solving program that works really closely with industry and policymakers. As a matter of fact, all the questions and problems that we're pursuing are of interest to the science here, but were brought to us by industry or policy. So it's truly applied in that somebody needs help with a question and we are trying to address that problem. And I want to just give Louise Bowditch a minute to talk about the center. She wants to share some thoughts.
Louise Bowditch is the chairwoman of the board.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. I am the chair of the board, but I'm also a really happy donor. One of the things that people don't understand about how science gets funded and how the work of Nichole gets funded is it's people in this room who give to support an idea that is brand new, it's risky, but it means or can mean a great deal to all of the oceans and in particular to people here on the coast of Maine. The Center for Venture Research, now Seafood Solutions, was begun as an idea in Nichole's head, and the money to get it going so that she can now do this amazing research that she does to support the aquaculture industry in our state. This money came from philanthropy. It did not come from NOAA or any of the national funders. It came from donors like you. So please keep in mind that it's not just the government that funds science, it's people who fund science, particularly the kind of science that Nichole does that has a high impact, is very applied, and really important for the people in this state. Thanks.
Thanks, Louise. I would say, too, that what I focused on tonight was the macroalgae seaweed industry, aquaculture in particular. We work with wild harvesters, we work with shellfish aquaculturists, finfish aquaculturists, wild caught fisheries like lobster. So it's just a small part of what the center does that I've represented tonight. And I really thank you for listening and for coming. Excuse me, I'm glad to take questions.